On a November night in 1966, Marine Guard Winnie Boyce watched through the darkness as a lone North Vietnamese soldier climbed the sheer cliff face below his position. The enemy sapper had somehow penetrated the tripwires, the claymores, the early warning systems that were supposed to make infiltration impossible. Boyce tracked him with his rifle as the soldier reached the summit and began moving between sleeping Marines. The NVA soldier inspected their radio equipment. He stole sea rations, he examined stacked 81mm mortar rounds, and each time Boyce held his fire. One stray bullet could hit a sleeping Marine. One ricochet could destroy the irreplaceable intelligence equipment. One spark near those mortar rounds could kill everyone on the rock. Therefore the guard could only watch as the intruder opened a mortar casing and began eating what he apparently thought was food. After some moaning, the North Vietnamese soldier simply disappeared over the side of the cliff, a 270-foot fall into the jungle darkness below. But this wasn't some jungle firebase or valley outpost where such an infiltration might be expected. This was the summit of the most improbable position in the entire Vietnam War. A jagged limestone fang 790 feet tall and 40 feet long at its widest point, where 20 Americans lived in complete isolation, supplied only by helicopter, directing the fire of 80 artillery pieces across the entire demilitarized zone. The enemy wanted it desperately. They tried repeatedly to take it. They never succeeded. But the battles fought in its shadow would cost hundreds of American lives, generate 4 medals of honor, and produce some of the most savage fighting of the entire northern campaign. This is the story of the Rockpile. The freak of geology that would become one of the war's most storied positions sits in Quảng Trị Province, approximately 10 miles south of the DMZ and 1 kilometer north of Route 9. The critical east-west supply artery linking Dong Ha to Kha San and the Lao Tian border. Vietnamese called it Nui Mot. The Americans who first saw it from helicopters in July 1966 called it something else. Time magazine correspondent Frank McCulloch, visiting in October, described it as a jagged, 750-foot fang of granite that thrusts upward at the intersection of 3 river valleys and 2 enemy trails. Stars and Stripes correspondent Ray Mahon compared it to Gibraltar, calling it a freak of nature shaped like that famous rock that rises 750 feet in the air, noting that in other wars it could have been called Bunker Hill, Heartbreak Ridge, or Porkchop Hill. But the Marines who would live and die in its shadow had a simpler name. They called it the Rockpile. And they were about to find out why the North Vietnamese wanted control of it so badly. A Marine reconnaissance team from 3rd Reconnaissance Battalion, led by 2nd Lieutenant Theod Terrebonne Jr., first noted the formation on July 4, 1966. What they observed was tactically significant. The Rockpile sat at the junction of 5 major valleys, all serving as North Vietnamese infiltration routes from the DMZ and Laos into South Vietnam's populous coastal plain. From its summit, observers could see ships on the South China Sea 20 miles to the east and the mountains of Laos to the west. It was the perfect observation post for the entire northern I Corps tactical zone. Therefore, 12 days later, on July 16th, a platoon from 1st Force Reconnaissance Company rappelled from a Marine helicopter onto the summit. They were the first Americans to set foot on what would become one of the war's most contested pieces of real estate. But they would not be alone for long. The North Vietnamese 324th Bravo Division immediately understood what the American occupation meant. Every supply column moving through those 5 valleys would now be visible. Every troop movement could be tracked. Every artillery battery position could be plotted. Therefore, within days of the American arrival, NVA soldiers began trying to dislodge them. Multiple attempts to scale the sheer cliff faces failed. The limestone was sharp as coral, cutting hands and faces of climbers who tried. An enemy force might reach the top in 5 hours. One Marine officer calculated, but they would arrive exhausted, bleeding, reduced to single-file squads that could be cut down before they gained footing on the tiny summit. Mortar rounds lobbed from surrounding ridgelines proved equally futile. The summit was simply too small and too high. Rounds that missed by even a few meters sailed harmlessly past and exploded in the jungle far below. The Rockpile was, by its very nature, a fortress. But that fortress needed defenders, and the men who would be sent to live on top of it were about to discover that reaching their new home was almost as dangerous as holding it. The summit of the Rockpile measured 40 feet long by 17 feet at its widest point, barely larger than a tennis court. and the only way to reach it was by helicopter. Initially, the aging UH-34 dog from Marine Medium Helicopter Squadrons attempted the mission. Later, the CH-46 Sea Knight took over for heavier lifts, but landing on the Rockpile was an act of controlled terror that pilots dreaded. The wooden helicopter pad was described by Stars and Stripes as a pallet-like platform about 6 feet wide with 8-inch gaps between the planks so that landing could become a thing of delicacy. In calm weather, pilots touched only their rear wheels on the pad and dropped the ramp while keeping the rotor spinning. Supplies and personnel had perhaps 30 seconds to exit before the bird had to lift off, but calm weather on an exposed 790-foot peak was rare. Wind frequently exceeded 50 miles per hour. Therefore, in high wind, pilots couldn't land at all. They hovered 6 to 7 feet above the rocks while crew chiefs pushed supplies out the door. Personnel going up or coming down dangled from cables through the belly hellhole while wind gusts threatened to slam them into the cliff face or send the helicopter spinning into the rocks. And every pilot flying that mission knew that one mistake, one wind shear, one mechanical failure meant everyone aboard was going to die on impact with the jungle 790 feet below. Corporal Ted Dudley of 1st Radio Battalion, who served 2 rotations in October and November 1966, left one of the most vivid accounts of life on the summit. Looking down from the doorway of a UH-34 at what was to be our new home and the boards they called an LZ, he wrote, "I began to have second thoughts and wondered out loud, whose bright idea was this anyway?" He described watching pilots at Dong Ha come up with all the excuses as to why they could not fly that mission, noting that only the best would risk it. One radio operator, extracted by cable from a CH-46 during a wind gust, had the cable nearly snap. He dangled beneath the helicopter at roughly 1,000 feet, while the crew chief struggled to catch the fraying line. After 15 minutes of hanging in space, watching the cable fray further with each gust, the pilot managed to set him back on rocks near the pad, nearly dropping 1,000 feet without a parachute. The man later wrote, "Was one of the closest calls I had during my year in Vietnam. But he was lucky, other men weren't, and the weather didn't care about luck." A typical summit garrison numbered roughly 20 personnel. A 4-man Marine direction-finding team from 1st Radio Battalion operated PRD-1 equipment, intercepting and locating North Vietnamese radio transmissions. A 5-man force recon team provided security. A sniper from 4th Marine Scout snipers watched the approaches. Forward artillery observers directed fire missions to Camp Carroll and other fire support bases, and a contingent of Army technicians ran sophisticated electronic surveillance gear monitoring NVA communications across the entire DMZ. The Provisional Marine Team, including an officer, rotated every 30 days. Therefore, for 30 days at a time, these 20 men lived in complete isolation from the rest of the war. Water came in cans by helicopter. When weather grounded flights, Marines caught rain in ponchos rigged as funnels. Sea rations arrived the same way, as empty water cans piled up and sea rats became scarce. Dudley recalled, "Even the white bread in the sea rats we never ate started tasting like porterhouse steaks. There was no laundry. Dirty clothes were collected in bags and flown to the Philippines for washing. Entertainment was nil. A Bible left by one rotation was passed to the next. At night, North Vietnamese soldiers probed the south side approach, trying to steal grenades, trip flares, and claymores. Yet paradoxically, Marines considered it the best assignment in the DMZ. This place is ideal for the guy who has about 1 month left to go in Vietnam, one recon Marine told Stars and Stripes. He can put his month in up here feeling pretty sure he will make it back to the States in one piece. But that assessment was based on life atop the rock. The real war was happening in the valleys and ridgelines below, and that war was about to become one of the bloodiest of the entire DMZ campaign. Operation Hastings, launched July 15 through August 3, 1966, was the largest coordinated offensive to that date. 8,000 Marines and 3,000 ARV soldiers under Brigadier General Lowell English attacked to secure the Rockpile area against the NVA 324th Bravo Division. The fighting killed 824 North Vietnamese at a cost of 126 Marines killed and 448 wounded. When Hastings ended on August 3rd, Operation Prairie began the next day. It would run through January 31st, 1967, and generate a cascade of savage engagements in the Rockpile's shadow that would make the previous operation look like a skirmish. The Groucho Marx fight on August 6th through 9th set the tone. A 5-man Stingray recon team inserted 4 kilometers north of the Rockpile, spotted NVA movement and called artillery. But when North Vietnamese forces closed in, reinforcements from Company E, 2nd Battalion, 4th Marines arrived by CH-46. Only 20 of 45 Marines were evacuated before fire intensified. Therefore, Captain Howard Lee flew in with 7 men to reinforce. What followed was a 30-hour nightmare. Lee's small force was surrounded and outnumbered. NVA troops attacked in waves through the night. Lee was hit by grenade fragments in the legs, but continued directing his Marines' fire and calling artillery danger close to their position. Major Vincil Hazelbaker of VMO-2, whose UH-1E gunship was crippled by a rocket during an ammunition resupply run, stayed overhead directing napalm strikes at first light, despite his damaged aircraft. When Marine reinforcements finally broke through, they found Lee still on his feet, still giving orders, his uniform soaked in blood. The Marines lost 5 killed and 27 wounded. At least 37 North Vietnamese died in the immediate area, but intelligence estimated the actual casualties were far higher. Lee received the Medal of Honor, presented by President Johnson on October 25, 1967. Hazelbaker earned the Navy Cross, but the fighting around the Rockpile was just beginning, and the next battles would be fought for terrain that seemed designed specifically to kill Marines. Directly across from the Rockpile reared a steep ridge the Marines called the Razorback. Its sides were pocked with caves dug by the Japanese in World War II but now occupied by North Vietnamese troops. An NVA DH-K heavy machine gun positioned on the Razorback fired on supply helicopters serving the Rockpile summit, forcing pilots to take evasive action that made an already dangerous approach even more deadly. Therefore, in late August, Marines from 2nd Battalion 4th were ordered to take the ridge and eliminate the gun. The first battle of the Razorback began on August 23rd. The Marines attacked uphill and were immediately ambushed when North Vietnamese soldiers emerged from 6 caves simultaneously. The fighting killed 21 Marines and an estimated 120 to 170 NVA. A captured prisoner from the 803rd Regiment, 324th Bravo Division revealed his unit's mission to neutralize the Rockpile and then attack Cam Lo. But the bloodiest fighting was still ahead, and it would take place on a ridgeline that would earn a name no Marine who fought there would ever forget. Noi Kay Tre Ridge rose northwest of the Rockpile, dominated by hills 404-84. North Vietnamese forces entrenched on the ridge were bombarding the Rockpile with mortars, making helicopter resupply even more dangerous than usual. Therefore, on September 22, 1966, 3rd Battalion 4th Marines launched what became known as the Mutter's Ridge Campaign, named for the radio call sign of the battalion. The fight to clear hills 404-84 lasted 2 weeks. For 3 days, enemy fire was so intense that medevac helicopters could not land to extract wounded Marines. Therefore, pilots dropped 1,000-pound bombs to blast craters deep enough for choppers to set down under some protection from the ridgeline fire. Marines fought in 100-degree heat with limited water. Wounded men waited hours for evacuation, some dying before help could reach them. And then on October 5th, during the assault on Hill 484, Marine tanks were brought up for direct fire support. But the tanks were improperly sighted. 2 rounds missed the enemy positions and struck Marine positions on Hill 400 instead, killing Captain James Carroll and causing 13 additional casualties from friendly fire. The men who survived Mutter's Ridge would remember Captain Carroll as an exceptional officer who had led from the front throughout the campaign. Therefore, on November 10, 1966, the Marine Corps birthday, the artillery fire support base near the Rockpile was dedicated as Camp Carroll in his honor. That base would become one of the most important artillery positions in the entire DMZ, mounting 16 guns that would fire hundreds of thousands of rounds over the next 2 years. But Carroll's death illustrated the chaotic, close-quarters nature of the fighting around the Rockpile, where Marines and North Vietnamese fought at such close range that supporting arms became as dangerous to friendlies as to the enemy. And there was one photograph taken during the Mutter's Ridge fighting that would become one of the most famous images of the entire war. Photojournalist Larry Burrows of Life magazine was embedded with the Marines on Hill 400. On October 5th, the same day Captain Carroll was killed, Burrows photographed a wounded black Marine sergeant reaching out toward a white Marine corporal sitting beside him in the mud. Both men were exhausted, covered in filth, faces blank with the 1,000-yard stare that comes from days of continuous combat. The image, titled "Reaching Out," captured something about the war that no amount of after-action reports could convey. The total integration of American forces under fire. The bond between men who had nothing in common except the fact that they were trying to keep each other alive. The photograph appeared in Life magazine and later won international acclaim. But Burrows himself would die in 1971 when his helicopter was shot down over Laos, and the fighting around the Rockpile continued, because the North Vietnamese were not finished testing American resolve in the DMZ. Before we continue with the story of the bloodiest fighting yet to come, including a 20-year-old Marine from Compton who would throw himself on a grenade to save his squad, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button. This channel exists to tell the stories of the men who fought in Vietnam, the battles that shaped the war, and the lessons that were learned at terrible cost. If you believe these stories matter, if you think the sacrifices made by men like Captain Carroll and the Marines of Mutter's Ridge deserve to be remembered, then subscribe and help us keep telling them. Now let's talk about what happened when the North Vietnamese launched their most sustained offensive yet against the Rockpile sector, and why a new concept in artillery fire control would turn that exposed summit into the brain of the entire DMZ artillery network. Operation Prairie officially consisted of 4 phases that ran from August 3, 1966 through May 17, 1967. The cumulative casualties across those 9 months tell the story of sustained, grinding attrition warfare. Prairie 1 cost 226 to 239 American lives, with roughly 1,214 wounded. Prairie 2 cost 93 American lives, with 483 wounded. Prairie 3 cost 56 American lives, with 530 wounded. Prairie 4 cost 164 American lives, with 1,240 wounded. Combined across all 4 phases, Operation Prairie killed roughly 539 to 552 Americans and wounded approximately 3,467 more. North Vietnamese losses were estimated at 2,848 killed and 60 captured. But those numbers don't capture the innovation that came out of the Rockpile fighting, an innovation that would change how artillery was employed across the entire northern I-Corps area. The concept was called Stingray. It married reconnaissance teams operating in the field with artillery observers on the Rockpile summit who could see the entire battlefield simultaneously. When a recon team spotted enemy movement in one of the 5 valleys, they called the Rockpile. The summit observers, using ships' binoculars mounted on the landing zone, could often see the target area even when the recon team on the ground could not see beyond the immediate tree line. Therefore, the Rockpile observers directed fire from Camp Carroll's 80-gun artillery fan, including 175mm self-propelled guns with a range of 32,690 meters. Those guns could hit targets from the South China Sea all the way to Laos. On July 28, 1966, a patrol near the Rockpile spotted approximately 200 NVA troops in the open. Artillery called from the summit killed 50 in a matter of minutes. In December 1966 alone, Marine artillery executed 10,388 fire missions, expending 36,869 rounds. The Rockpile had become not just an observation post, but the central fire direction center for the entire DMZ campaign. But observation and fire direction still required defenders, and defending the approaches to the rock meant fighting battles that produced some of the most extraordinary acts of valor of the entire war. At least 4 medals of honor were awarded for actions in the Rockpile area during 1966 and 67. We've already discussed Captain Howard Lee's defense of the Groucho Marx recon team, but there were others. Captain Robert Mdrzejewski of Company K, 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, earned his medal during Operation Hastings on July 15 through 18, 1966, when he crawled 200 meters under fire to deliver ammunition to cut off squads and directed artillery fire within meters of his own position against battalion-strength NVA attacks. Staff Sergeant John McGinty III, 1st Platoon, Company K, 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, earned his during the same operation. McGinty later described the fighting in stark terms. "Charlie moved in waves," he recalled. "We estimated we were being attacked by 1,000 men. We just couldn't kill them fast enough." But perhaps the most heartbreaking Medal of Honor story from the Rockpile area belongs to a young Marine who had been in Vietnam less than 3 months when he made the decision that would cost him his life. Private First Class James Anderson Jr. was 20 years old, from Compton, California. On February 28, 1967, during Operation Prairie 2, his platoon from Company F, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Marines, was advancing through dense jungle northwest of Cam Lo to extract a besieged reconnaissance patrol. They were hit by intense automatic weapons fire. Marines went down. The platoon tried to maneuver, but the jungle was too thick and the fire too heavy. And then Anderson saw a grenade roll alongside his head. He had perhaps 2 seconds to react. 2 seconds to process what was happening. 2 seconds to understand that if that grenade detonated, it would kill or wound multiple Marines in his immediate vicinity. Therefore, Anderson grabbed the grenade, pulled it to his chest, and curled his body around it as it detonated. The blast killed him instantly, but every Marine near him survived. James Anderson Jr. became the first African-American Marine to receive the Medal of Honor. His sacrifice represented the kind of split-second decision that separated life from death in the jungle around the Rockpile, where terrain and vegetation meant that battles were fought at distances measured in meters, where grenades and small arms mattered more than artillery or air support, and where individual acts of courage determined whether squads survived or died. The Rockpile also produced future legends whose names would become famous for later actions. Captain John Ripley commanded Lima Company, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines, known as Ripley's Raiders, from the Rockpile area in 1967. He earned a Silver Star on August 21st for leading a relief column to rescue a pinned-down convoy under intense automatic weapons fire. Ripley would later destroy the Dong Ha Bridge in 1972 in one of the most celebrated individual feats of the war, hand-carrying explosives under the bridge while under fire for 3 hours. Earning the Navy Cross. A memorial at the National Museum of the Marine Corps reads, "Rest upon these boulders quarried from the Rockpile, northern Quảng Trị Province." Lieutenant Oliver North served as a platoon commander with Kilo Company, 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines at the Rockpile in 68 and 69. Captain Otto Lerich, commanding India Company, 3rd Battalion, 3rd, later wrote No Shining Armor in 1992, the definitive oral history of the battalion's DMZ war. 1st Lieutenant James Brown, a forward observer with Charlie Battery, 1st Battalion, 12th Marines, supporting 3rd Battalion, 3rd, authored Impact Zone, the Battle of the DMZ in Vietnam in 2004, with an entire chapter titled The Rockpile. But the unit most synonymous with the Rockpile was 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines itself, and the price that battalion paid tells the story of what holding the DMZ actually cost. 3rd Battalion, 3rd Marines lost 653 men killed during its entire Vietnam deployment. The battalion spent over 1,600 days in country and conducted 48 combat operations, the most of any Marine battalion in the war. They fought in Operation Hastings. They fought in all 4 phases of Prairie. They fought in Operation Cimarron. They fought in Operation Kentucky. They fought in Operation Scotland and the relief of Khe Sanh. The Rockpile was their home, their observation post, their artillery direction center, and their graveyard. The enemy they faced was principally the North Vietnamese 324th Bravo Division, whose 803rd, 812, and 90th regiments rotated through the area. But intelligence identified 3 additional NVA divisions operating in or near the DMZ sector during 66 and 67, the 304th, 341st, and 325 Charlie. Time magazine reported that 6 Marine battalions had been battling 2 entire divisions of North Vietnamese regulars whose apparent aim was to invade Quảng Trị Province. And that assessment raised the question that plagued commanders throughout the campaign. Was defending the Rockpile worth the cost? Critics questioned defending an isolated position that consumed helicopter sorties and tied down troops that might be used elsewhere. Every supply run to the summit meant a helicopter that couldn't be used for medevac or troop insertion. Every Marine rotating through the summit detail was a rifleman who couldn't be used in the valley fighting. Therefore, some officers argued for abandoning the position entirely and relying on aerial reconnaissance instead. But the defenders of the Rockpile strategy had compelling answers. First, the natural fortress made ground assault nearly suicidal for attackers. An enemy force might eventually reach the summit, but they would arrive exhausted, bleeding from the sharp coral-like rocks, reduced to single-file squads that could be cut down before gaining footing. Second, the observation capability was irreplaceable. No other position offered a 360-degree view of all 5 infiltration valleys simultaneously. Aircraft could observe specific targets, but couldn't maintain continuous watch the way a fixed summit post could. Third, occupying the Rockpile sealed off the Cam Lo to Dong Ha corridor, forcing NVA infiltrators onto higher and more dangerous routes closer to Laos where they were more exposed to American firepower. And fourth, the summit was never overrun, not once in 3 years of continuous occupation, a claim that neither Con Thien nor Khe Sanh could make without qualification. But to understand why the Rockpile mattered, you need to understand how it compared to the other major outposts along the DMZ. Con Thien, just 2 miles from the DMZ, was hammered by an average of 200 rounds of North Vietnamese artillery and rocket fire daily during the 1967 siege. Marines called it the Hill of Angels because so many men died there. Khe Sanh endured a 77-day siege beginning January 21, 1968, with 6,000 Marines trapped in World War I-style trench conditions after Route 9 was cut. Camp Carroll, born from the Rockpile battles and named for the captain killed by friendly fire, served as the primary artillery hub with 16 guns but suffered devastating bombardment, including 400 rounds in a single day during Prairie 2. The Rockpile's paradox was that the same terrain that made resupply perilous made enemy assault impossible. No other outpost in the war had this characteristic: vulnerability in logistics, invulnerability in defense. Therefore, while Con Thien and Khe Sanh grabbed headlines with dramatic sieges, the Rockpile quietly performed its mission day after day, month after month, directing the artillery that made those other positions defensible. And when Khe Sanh came under siege in early '68, it was the Rockpile's 175mm guns, shared with Camp Carroll, that fired over 150,000 rounds during the siege, providing the long-range fire support that kept the North Vietnamese from overrunning the base. During Operation Pegasus in April 1968, the relief of Khe Sanh, Route 9 between the Rockpile and Kha Lu, was upgraded to allow pre-staging of supplies. The Rockpile continued operating as a radio relay station between Dong Ha and Camp Vandegrift through fall '68. But as Vietnamization progressed and American forces began drawing down, the decision was made to close the position. In late 1969, when 3rd Marines stood down and departed Vietnam, the Rockpile was abandoned. On its last major day of fighting, September 17, 1969, during Operation Idaho Canyon, 25 Marines were killed and 47 wounded in action above the Rockpile, with 48 enemy dead. And then the helicopters stopped coming. The radio equipment was packed out, the observation posts were dismantled, the wooden landing pad was left to rot, and the Rockpile returned to being what it had been before July 16, 1966. Just a freak of geology jutting out of the Vietnamese jungle. But the men who fought in its shadow would never forget it. Today, a Vietnamese flag flies atop the peak. American veterans who return to Vietnam sometimes hire guides to take them to the base of the Rockpile. Few attempt the climb anymore. The rock is still there, still sharp as coral, still 790 feet of near-vertical limestone. But the landing pad is gone, the radio bunker is gone, the sangars and fighting positions are gone. What remains are the memories of the men who lived up there for 30-day rotations, who watched the war spread out below them like a map, who called fire missions that killed enemy soldiers they would never see, who endured isolation and boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror when weather closed in or when NVA sappers probed the summit at night. What remains are the Medal of Honor citations for men like James Anderson Jr., who had 2 seconds to decide between living and dying and chose to save his friends instead. What remains are the after-action reports from battles with names like Mutter's Ridge and the Razorback, where Marines fought North Vietnamese soldiers emerging from World War II Japanese caves in fighting so close that grenades mattered more than artillery. What remains are the statistics. 653 Marines from 3rd Battalion 3rd killed across 1,600 days in country, roughly 550 Americans killed during Operation Prairie's 4 phases, 2,800 North Vietnamese estimated killed in those same battles, numbers that don't capture the individual moments of terror and courage, but that add up to one of the most sustained campaigns of the entire war. The Rockpile story is not one of a single dramatic siege, but of grinding, daily attrition warfare waged over 3 years. It's the story of 20 men living on a tennis court-sized summit, supplied by helicopters that often couldn't land, watching 5 valleys that served as the North Vietnamese main supply routes into South Vietnam. It's the story of an innovation called Stingray that turned a rock into an artillery brain directing 80 guns across an entire tactical zone. It's the story of battles fought in the shadow of that rock, where Marines charged uphill into machine gun fire because the high ground mattered, and because holding the high ground meant fewer Marines would die in the valleys below. It's the story of helicopter pilots who flew missions they knew were nearly suicidal, because the men on that summit needed water and ammunition and mail from home. It's the story of forward observers who called fire danger close to their own positions, because that was the only way to break up enemy attacks. It's the story of men like Captain James Carroll, killed by friendly fire, and men like Private First Class James Anderson Jr., killed by his own hand when he pulled a grenade to his chest. It's the story of a war within the war, a campaign that has been largely overshadowed by Khe Sanh and the Tet Offensive, but that arguably mattered more to the daily prosecution of the DMZ fighting. Because while Khe Sanh grabbed the headlines, the Rockpile directed the artillery. And in a war of attrition along a fixed line, artillery was everything. The men who served at the Rockpile describe it with a complicated mix of pride and sorrow when they return. Pride, because they held an impossible position against an enemy that tried repeatedly to take it and never succeeded. Sorrow because of the friends who died in the valleys and ridgelines below, men whose names are now on panel after panel of the Vietnam Memorial Wall in Washington. The Rockpile represented everything about the American war in Vietnam that was both remarkable and futile. Remarkable because a handful of men held a position that had no business being defensible, turning it into a tactical asset that shaped the entire northern campaign. Futile because after 3 years of fighting, after 653 dead from 1 battalion alone, after thousands of casualties across dozens of operations, the position was simply abandoned when the political decision was made to draw down American forces. The flag came down, the helicopters stopped flying, and the jungle reclaimed what had briefly been American territory. But the cost in blood and sacrifice to hold it, to use it, to defend it against an enemy that understood its value as clearly as the Americans did, that cost was real, and the men who paid it deserved to have their story told. This was that story. This was the Rockpile.